Today is the 26th of July, 2011, and I'm Lester Sharlach here on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. And my videographer today is Alyssa Kaplan. And we have the pleasure of interviewing Ezra Karp at his offices at the William Pitt Realtors on Long Ridge Road in Stamford. Good morning, Ezra. Ezra, I know you've been in Stamford a long time. Were you born here?
Yes, 72 years.
And where were you born?
I was born in Stamford Hospital, and when my mother and father let me get out of the hospital, we lived on Randall Street. Randall Street is, well, it's actually off of East Main Street, which I don't believe is there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there we moved to Colonial Road. And from Colonial Road we moved to Hope Street, which is now a condominium, just past the park in the middle of the street on Hope Street. And from there we moved to Lafayette Street, and from Lafayette Street to Denise Place. And after that, I was married.
Well, let's go talk a little bit about your childhood. And what school did you go to?
Well, I started at Stark School because I lived on Colonial Road at that point.
What number on Colonial Road?
88 Colonial Road,
Mm-hmm.
which is still there. In fact, Herman Oswanger lives up the street.
They lived at 108.
Right, you remember that. And Hermie, I can remember Hermie at about 8 years old, pedaling up Colonial Road on his bicycle, trying to make it the hill. Colonial Road is a hill.
Yeah.
And I just mentioned that to him the other day, because I remember that. And I went to Stark School from kindergarten through 4th. And then we moved up. Well, let me go back. Living on that street on Colonial Road in those days was Herb Queskin, who lived across the street. Herb, and I remember when David was born, and his daughter was born, and down the street was the Londons, and I remember them as kids. And further down the street was a bowling alley, which is now what became a Wetson's, and now it's a coffee shop.
Donut shop.
Donut shop. And I can remember the war a little bit, because I was born in 1939, and I remember my father was an air raid warden. And I do remember stamps a little bit, food stamps.
When your dad was an air raid warden, what was he, a spotter?
Yeah, I remember he had all the equipment. He had the gas mask and the equipment, which we used to play with. And when there was an air raid, he would then, I don't know, he would go out.
Yeah, because I can remember the spotters going to the roof of Stamford High School, and they would had these scale models of planes, and they were supposed to go up there to identify any planes that were flying.
Yeah, well, that I don't remember. I think he was like the neighborhood air raid warden. I think he was supposed to protect Colonial Road.
And when you were at Stark School, is there any special teachers that you remember?
Well, I have an uncanny memory. I can remember a lot of things. I could probably remember every school teacher.
Really?
I started with Miss Whitehead, who was my kindergarten teacher. Miss Smith was my first grade teacher, and she followed me to Miss Peebles was my first grade teacher. Miss Smith was the second teacher. And, I said I have a good memory. Miss Marr was my 4th grade teacher. I remember one thing that might be interested. Stark School, which is still on Glenbrook Road, we used to play in the background. There was a big back playground. And next to it was St. Maurice's Church, which later became a school. And I can remember at those days we used to go home for lunch. Of course, not in kindergarten, we didn't go home, but from first to fourth, we used to go home. So I can remember going up back and forth Schofield Avenue, going back to home, having lunch and then returning for the afternoon.
And what was your next school experience?
Well, then we moved to Hope Street, and I was allowed to stay in Stark School through fourth grade. So I was in Stark School when I lived at both those places. But then when I moved to Lafayette Street, we had to go to Rogers School,
And what number did you live at in Lafayette Street?
124.
Because I can recall that when the Jewish people came from Eastern Europe and came to Stanford, most of them were on Pacific Street, Brook
Right.
Street, and that area. And then the next step up
Was
the ladder
Lafayette.
was Lafayette
Yeah,
Street.
well, my grandmother lived on Hawthorne Street,
Yeah.
and she bought the house on Lafayette Street.
What was the number of the house, do you remember?
On Hawthorne Street?
No, on Lafayette.
Lafayette was 124 Lafayette Street.
Mhm.
And in fact, when you go, I'm going to give you a picture of the house because I happen to have it.
Uh-huh.
Not from those days, but I happen to have the picture.
Do you remember the neighborhood? Who
Oh,
else was
sure,
it?
sure. The Trails lived there, Robert, Stephen, and a younger brother, which I don't remember his name, but he's now down in Atlanta. I still see Robert, and I still see Steve.
Mhm.
He owns Acme
Sign.
Company. And there was another Karps. The Karps who owned the bakery lived a couple of houses down.
Mhm.
And then next to them, he had a store on Pacific Street, but I can't remember his name.
What kind of a store was it?
It was, on Pacific Street, it was like a, you and I would call it a junk store, but it was like secondhand stuff. Can't remember his name. He was next to the bakery on Pacific Street. I can't think of his name.
Well, my grandfather and my uncle had a secondhand furniture
What
store,
was their name?
Sharlach's
That's who
Furniture.
it is, Sharlach. That's right, Sharlach. Yeah, I remember the son, and I remember the mother,
Yeah.
and I think they owned that house, I'm not sure.
They owned their house on St. John's Place,
Okay.
actually.
That's right, it was Sharlach. And those were, down the street were the Lotsteins had their, that's where the mother lived. And
Yeah.
that's where the Lotsteins, every Friday night you could see them lined up with their cars because they used to go to the grandmother's house
Yeah.
for Shabbos. And across the street was the Friedmans, Carl Friedman and Marilyn Friedman, who's now Marilyn Goebel.
Mhm.
So there's some more there, but those are the ones that Stanford would remember. Abe Sharlach was his name, I remember. Big guy. And so I went to Rogers School from that point. And there I had Miss Vaccaro, and I think she moved with us. She was lucky. She moved from 5th to 6th grade. I left there in 6th grade. I made that was a good opportunity for me to meet a lot of people that I now see in my older age, especially when I ended up at Stanford High School, because we all ended up, in those days, at Stanford High School because there was only one high school.
Mhm.
And then in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, I went to Burdick Junior High School on Forest Street, which is now an apartment house, which my father went to high school for a couple of years in that school. And then we went to Stanford High School for the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade.
I can remember spending a lot of time on Lafayette Street because I lived a couple blocks over on the other side of the tracks on Lincoln Avenue.
Mhm.
And I remember the Shermans, the sign painter.
Well,
lived
Sherman, yeah, I forgot about them.
there. Yeah, Bloomfield.
Yaspin's,
Yeah, Yosman had a
That's
paint
a great
store
one.
on Pacific Street.
yeah. The Shermans, who was a sign painter,
Yeah, Herb Sherman.
Herb Sherman, and he rented out part of our office. So his sign company was in our office. As far as I can remember, he was always there.
Let's talk a few minutes about your parents.
Well, my father was born in Stanford.
What year?
1911, I believe, so I think he would have been 100 years old today.
Mhm.
And my mother was born in New York but moved to White Plains. And they met on a blind date in Portchester. And my grandparents, who I didn't know my grandfather because he died when my father was 9 years old. He was really the original Karp's bakery.
Oh,
When my grandfather and grandmother came here, they opened up a bakery. And when he died, when my father was 9 years old, they sold the bakery to their cousins. And the cousins were the ones that really ran the bakery until they sold it out to outside the Karp family.
yeah.
And so my grandmother was an excellent baker.
Mhm.
And in fact, the story goes that when Joe Lieberman says that his father drove a bakery wagon in his younger days, Joe's father, I believe that was Karp's bakery wagon.
Mhm.
But he never says it was Karp's bakery. So I'm sure because they lived across the street. And of course, going back, I'm sure people have told you about life on Hawthorne Street and Pacific Street and that was there when I was younger.
You remember Hawthorne
Oh
Street?
yeah, very well. My grandmother owned a 3-family house, and she lived in one of the apartments.
Was this your paternal grandmother?
My father's grandmother. And I can remember having seders there with the whole Karp family that used to take the whole apartment, starting in the kitchen. It was like a railroad apartment.
Mm-hmm.
The story goes that my grandfather and my grandmother were riding in their horse and wagon one day, and this house was being built. And my grandfather said to my grandmother, "That's a great house. I wonder whose house it is." And my grandmother said, "That's your house." She had saved enough money from the money that she got from her husband that she was able to buy that house.
Mm-hmm.
And that was their family house until she moved to Lafayette Street. And of course, Pacific Street, which I'm sure you have a lot of people have talked about Pacific Street.
Yeah.
I can remember that very well. I had an uncle who had a butcher shop there.
What was the name of the butcher shop?
Sauceman, it was Sauceman.
Oh, Salzman. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he was with his brother and then they broke up.
Mm-hmm.
And his name, my uncle was Victor Sauceman, who ran the butcher shop. But before he started the butcher shop, we went across the street to Brazel's. And that was Shirley Sklar.
Mm-hmm.
And down the street there was, as I said, Karp's Bakery. There was a store next to Karp's Bakery called Max Myers. I don't know, that was like the first 7-Eleven kind of store.
Yeah.
And my father worked there as a young kid. He told me he used to sweep the floors and take care. And Max Myers was also a cousin of the Karp family.
Oh.
And I can remember all the stores. The Live Chicken Place.
That wasn't the Jewish one.
No, but I remember it.
Yeah.
I really remember that place. And Cousins.
Cousin Shapiro.
Yeah, Riblin had a shoe store there. Ben's Locks Box across the street. Wise Paint, of course, they weren't Jewish. I don't think the Wises were Jewish.
Oh, yes.
Were they?
Yeah, he was president. The founder of the business was the president of the Good of Shalom
Oh, I
at one
didn't know
time.
that.
Yeah.
Then there was Scalzi Paint, which was
Yeah.
an Italian family. There was a lot more. That's about it.
Cosmeter, remember that?
Who?
Cosmeter, he had a liquor store and a pet shop.
Yeah.
In Wattenberg, a leather goods store.
But I do remember now that you mention it, the family was at the hardware store,
Sandhouse.
Sandhouse, and then he moved up to East Main Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the store on East Main Street, because I lived right near there, that was a little grocery store. A Jewish man owned by the name of Cohen ran it. And when he closed, Sandhouse moved into that
Yeah, I remember
space.
that. In fact, I think I remember Cone. Didn't he have a toy store there?
I don't remember a toy
Yeah,
store.
I think he did.
And your grandparents, what did they do for a living? Was it just the bakery that they?
Yeah, that was it. Because as I said, when my grandfather died, she sold the bakery out, and probably I would have ended up in the bakery business. But I had one uncle who opened up a hardware store, which was Karp's Hardware. I had another uncle who went into the Army. When he got out of the Army, he went to work for my uncle. That was Ezra Karp.
Mm-hmm.
And another uncle who went to school with Abe Hecht, who probably was mentioned in part of your archives. He went to Brown, and he became a lawyer, and he was with the Justice Department for many years. And then there was two sisters, Bessie, who married Victor Saltzman, and Anna Rabinowitz, who was a widow, and she lived with my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, of course, there's a lot of offsprings coming out of that family. Walter, one of my cousins married a Walter. And he had the father had Walter, something Walters. There was a provision store down in Canal Street.
Rosenblum and Walters?
You've got a better memory than I do. And unfortunately, they got divorced.
Mm-hmm.
But another cousin of mine, whose father owned the hardware store, married Hy Fogel, who later came into the hardware business, and now, in this year, Hy Fogel's sons are running the business. So there's like third generation in that hardware store. And that was the immediate family. Because I had a brother and a sister, and my sister, my sister lives in, she had about 12 houses. She moved all over the country because of her husband. They now live in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, my brother passed away about 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, out of those siblings, the first generation siblings, there's a whole group of second cousins who live all over the country.
Well, let's get back. You graduated from Stanford High School in what year?
1957.
And what did you do after that?
I went to the University of Miami for about 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
studied broadcasting, and then transferred to a school called Emerson College in Boston for the last year and a half. Studied broadcasting, public relations, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I graduated, I got a job working in the mailroom at NBC. And because I was 1A, which means you're called into the Army. And while I was working there, I took my physical, and I flunked it, which is an interesting story. Very quickly, I had a slight thyroid condition. And I went to take my physical, and I put down on my application slight thyroid condition.
Mm-hmm.
And I got through the line, and there was a Jewish psychiatrist, and he said, "What's this a slight thyroid condition?" And I said, "Well, I gained a little weight, and the doctor put me on pills." Takes out his stamp, rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So I never went into the Army. And at that point, my father, whose partner was Harry Rosenbaum, asked me to come into their business for a short time because Harry had had a heart attack. And he needed somebody to help him out, and that's how I ended up in the Stanford shopper.
At this point, you're now back living in Stanford with your parents?
At that point, no, I had gotten married about a year before that.
What year did you get married?
1962.
Mm-hmm. And where did you meet your wife?
Well, it was set up. She lived on Denise Place,
Mm-hmm.
and I lived on I lived on Denise Place. She lived on Fawn Drive. And her mother and my mother knew each other from White Plains. So they were friendly. And my sister and my wife's sister were friends, and they set us up.
What was your wife's maiden name?
Well, the real name was Cone,
Mm-hmm.
but my father-in-law had changed it to Carroll,
Mm-hmm.
and he was in the brake business. In those days, he redid brakes.
In
In
Stanford?
Stanford, yeah. New Process Brake and Clutch Company.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked for gas stations, and they would send their brakes and clutches to be redone.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the days when they had asbestos was on the brakes.
Yeah. And where did you live when you got married?
91 Strawberry Hill,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, I just showed that an apartment in that building just yesterday. So it's changed a little bit, but that we lived there, and there was a lot of young Jewish couples living
Yeah.
there. There and 71 Strawberry Hill, and some of those people I'm still friendly with, still see.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some passed away, but we still see them.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the shopper. Do
Right.
you know, how did Sid Karp and Harry Rosenbaum get together and decide to?
Well, my father was working for Lou Conspor, who had a clothing shop in Stamford, and it was on the right where the railroad, right where the thruway is.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry had a store, which was his family's store, a couple of stores away. And Harry and my father were griping about the Advocate one day. And they said, well, let's start a paper. No, it's no big deal to start a paper.
Yeah.
So Harry ran the inside from his store, which I think he sold umbrellas.
Oh.
I think it was an umbrella store.
Mhm.
And my father was a salesman out picking up the ads. And that's how it started.
And what type of paper was it? Do you?
Yeah, well, paper was not a paid paper. The news was about people and things going on. It was like we used to call it the good newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
The local news wasn't news that happened yesterday or today or before. It was really about organizations and people and what's going on in Stamford.
So did you have reporters, or people just let the paper know?
We had people knew about us, and they would just send. We would get reams and reams of
Mhm.
stories of what was going on in Stamford.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, today I think the Advocate doesn't have any of that stuff.
No.
And I think that's what Stamford really misses, is knowing what's going on. Stamford's still a big little city, or a little big city.
What was the circulation of the shopper?
Well, in those days, about 30,000.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was mailed and part of it was delivered by young men throughout the city. And I used to go and check them, make sure they're doing a good job. But as years went on, it got very difficult to have kids that were responsible. And by that time, I had gotten more active in the business, so I then changed the whole circulation to mail. And the paper became the Stamford Shopper Weekly Mail.
As I recall, the biggest feature of the newspaper was articles for sale.
Right, well, that was done because there was a newspaper in Long Island that had the same idea, where one would put an article for sale and one would pay a commission when it was sold, the article was sold. And that was brought to the paper by a woman who moved from Long Island to Stamford and came to my father and said this was a good idea, and they put it in. However, it worked somewhat against us. Number one, people were not that honest, so when they sold their article, they didn't tell us. And a lot of merchants thought, well, the paper's only good for people buying used stuff and not good for my goods in my store.
Mhm.
So it became in fact, the other day I was thinking about it. If I was doing it today, I would have it all on the internet, part of the internet, and I would make people sign in what they're gonna see. Better, and then when they would see it, I would know they bought it, and it'd be a better check on it.
Better
But in
control.
those days, we figured everybody was honest.
Mhm.
But as time went on, I found that more people were dishonest than honest. But it was a section of people that people like to pick up the paper and read about it. Even if they weren't looking for an article,
Mhm.
it was like news.
Yeah. So actually, your dad and Harry Rosenbaum were merchant neighbors, and that's how they got
Right.
started.
Right.
And then the paper took off, and they left their businesses and
Right. Well,
started.
Harry's business went bankrupt. It was his father-in-law's.
Mm-hmm.
And my father quit the job at Lou Conspor's, and they opened up an office. And I think that's when Herb Sherman came along, and they gave him a little space in the office. The first office was on, which I don't remember, but they tell me it was on Bank Street next to C.O. Miller's. upstairs. Actually, I think that's where Wapsie Rose and Kuriansky ended up
Yeah.
for their first office. And then they moved to Atlantic Street.
I remember the Atlantic Street, it was next to the gas and electric company.
Right. And then from there, we moved across the street because the gas and electric company sold it to Urban Redevelopment.
Yeah.
And then we're across the street, and then Urban Redevelopment took that building, along with Karp's Hardware and other businesses there, and then we moved to Glenbrook.
The paper at the time was quite well read, and did it just stop, or did they sell the?
No, well, what happened was, as time went on, my father retired, and I bought 50% of the paper.
Mhm.
So Harry and I were partners, and I really made most of the decisions because by that time Harry was a little older, much older, and he didn't like change, like a lot of the older merchants. I'm sure even like your father-in-law and other people like that. Change was not good, and when Harry used to go to Florida a lot, and I became more aggressive, I made a lot of changes. And the paper got better, and shortly thereafter, he retired, and I took over the whole paper, and I ran the paper for the last 10 years of its existence.
Mhm.
And during that time, the paper really flourished because I went to innovative things. I was very innovative in doing things. Like I came up with a bride's edition, which a lot of papers still do. Some copied from me, some I see they came up with the idea of taking it's a pictorial ad rather than a regular kind of ad. And so I came up with special editions and special features. And that brought in a lot of income.
So were you out selling ads at the
I
time?
was doing everything. Circulation, selling ads. We had a bookkeeping department making sure they were doing well.
Mhm.
I hired an editor, and she did the photography and editorial work. I then started a paper in Greenwich called the Greenwich Suburbanite, and I took it. My idea was to get partners from Greenwich who would advertise, and that would make the paper grow faster, which I did. I took in partners who had a small piece of the business, and that did pretty well for a while. And so at the end, I was running 2 newspapers. We also were doing our own typesetting. So we were doing brochures and catalogs for other people, including Rovens. I remember we did it for Rovens. And we did all the, when the Jewish Center was being built, we did all the brochures for the Jewish Center. Mostly the typesetting. We then would send out for the printing elsewhere. And we did work for the Federation here in Stamford, Federation in Greenwich, Bicultural. We had a very big printing operation.
Were you actually doing physical printing, or just the?
We had a small printer that we did the small work, but the way that we did it is that we sent out the work to a printer depending on what kind of work it was.
Oh, I see.
If it was a newspaper, we sent it to a newspaper printer. If it was a book or catalog, it had to be on coded stock and that kind of stuff. We had another source. And we really, at one time, I think I had about 50 people working in the operation.
I think one of the things that sticks in my mind in the shopper was in the time when it was the Jewish holidays, Rosh
Right.
Hashanah, there would be one page of advertising a list of merchants that are closed for one day,
Right.
and another page of the merchants that
Well,
were
that was
closed for 2
interesting
days.
because as the years went on, there were less of those people closing.
Yeah.
And at the end of, when I ran the paper, there was no more closing.
Mhm.
People had employees that would stay open during that
Yeah.
time. Because business got tough, it got competitive, and they couldn't,
Right.
they couldn't take, there was a couple of stores, but financially it wasn't, they couldn't do it, to shut the store for 2 days. Some still do, even today.
Not many.
Not many, not many.
So what was the progression of the paper
Well, the paper started out, as I say, we had 30,000, and I went to every single home in Greenwich, so that had 20,000 circulation. And then we did other work, I say newspapers, the Jewish Voice. So the reason why we're able to do so well is that I was able to have a bigger circulation than the Advocate. And that was my key, that the Advocate, even though it was the daily paper, we had a bigger circulation. But then the mall came.
Mm-hmm.
And when the mall came, all my customers were mom and pop stores like yours. The only chain I had was, I had two chains. I had Caldor, which was the local chain store in Stamford, who was started by Carl Bennett, who, by the way, was a bookkeeper for the Stanford Shopper when he was going to college. And I got Woolworths. And how I got Woolworths, I went down, I couldn't get a hold of him, and he wouldn't make an appointment with me, and he happened to live in Stamford, the advertising guy. So I said, "You do come home at night, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "Well, I'll pick you up next week. What's a good day?" He told me the day, and I went down to New York, and I picked him up after work, drove him home, and after that I was getting weekly advertising from him. So those were the two chains. Well, we did get the factory store, and we did get some of the other chain stores. I would have to say we did. Factory store, I don't know, do you remember the factory store? Which
Yes.
was up in Norwalk?
Yeah.
And once in a while we'd get a supermarket. It was very hard getting supermarkets, but we did have Grand Central on the back of our paper for many, many years.
So when did you shut down?
Well, they didn't shut down. I received a call from the guy who was the publisher of the Advocate, who I learned later was fired. And he wanted to buy me out. His idea was to buy me out, buy other papers out, and move it along. And quite frankly, I saw that the town was losing its independent stores, and that was the basis of my business. And I realized that I had to take the next step, and I didn't really know. I thought, being part of a guy who knows about daily papers, that would be a good to move it forward. And so he gave me a number I couldn't refuse. Harry Rosenbaum wasn't happy because he was retired at that point, and he liked to come in. And a lot of people thought he still owned the business, but I did that on purpose because I didn't want to have the community think that he didn't own it anymore.
No, because he was such a big mocker in the community. Everyone knew it, and everyone knew Harry Rosenbaum.
Right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they knew him as outside, but they didn't know him
Exactly.
as running a newspaper.
Yeah.
He wasn't really a great businessman. He was more of a running organization. He would have been a good executive director of Jewish Center, which, by the way, at one time he was running Federation. He was acting as if he was executive. And I worked for them for a couple of years to make sure I get my payment. And this fellow Jay Shaw, who bought the paper, really wasn't as good as I thought. Really, being a publisher of the Advocate was a different kind of animal. And he sold part of the paper to Nick Mercedes, because he needed money, because he ran the paper. He thought he was running a daily, and he ran like a daily. If he had to have a plane to go someplace, because he bought other papers around. And I said to my wife, either he did doing something right, or I did something wrong, because I couldn't afford to take plane trips. And ultimately, I was right, he was wrong, and he ran into a lot of trouble. He bought business papers. He started a business paper. And ultimately, he sold the paper to the Patent Trader, and I went to work for them for a short time. Patent Trader was a paper out of Westchester. They thought it would be a logical move to move locally, to have a paper next to Westchester. And he didn't really know how to run a paper, in my estimation. And ultimately, went out of business. And
What year, what are we up to now, what year?
well, probably 90,
Mm-hmm.
1990. At that point, I had to decide what I was going to do because I was too young to retire. I did retire for about a week, and I became a honeydew.
Mm-hmm.
You know, honeydew this and honeydew that. So I did fool around a little bit with a screen printing business that a friend of mine owned, and he never had a sales staff, and I went to New York to try to sell different items. And he was a little bit ahead of himself, and we had a thing called McGruff, the dog, I don't know if you know the
Yes, I recall.
crime dog. And believe it or not, I sold it, the concept, and a big contract to a chain store, which was out of Hartford, was their Ayers, Ayers, Ayers department store. And I went up there to finish the deal, and that was the day Ayers department stores went bankrupt. So that was the end of that deal. And so I decided, you know, what am I gonna do now? And I said, well, listen, what I know is newspapers. And I heard about, and I knew about this paper up in Pound Ridge started by the wife of a cantor, Silbershire. He was a cantor, I think, at the Conservative Temple at one time. Anyway, to make a long story short, I went up there and ran that paper, which I thought was going to be 2 or 3 years, became 16 years. And it was ultimately bought by a company out of Milwaukee called Journal Communications. And it was fun because I always wanted to work for a corporation. You know, I was always in my own business to see what was better, owning your own business or working for a big corporation, and they both were lousy. But it was better owning your own paper than working for somebody. And I saw that paper go downhill. I went from the best, financially the best paper, to it was a monthly.
Mm-hmm.
But I changed that too. I started other papers in Westchester. I did calendars. I did took my bride's edition and I moved that up to Westchester. I started a bride's seminar where if you put an ad in the bride's edition, you could come to our show and for nothing. I did a lot of innovative things. But when you work for a corporation, it's never enough. Always want more. And I started to say I went from the best edition to the worst edition, and that was the beginning of the demise, I didn't know it at the time, of the newspaper business, which I thought was going to happen in Stamford because of the mall, which did happen in Stamford.
Yes.
The mall did cause all the mom and pop stores to close down. Very few were able to continue, and this year I think there's 2 or 3 that are still in business, that's it, that I can think of. Second generation, Zemo Brothers, Karp's Hardware,
Yeah, Polici's,
but
Saks up till this past month, he sold out.
did he sell out?
Yeah.
I didn't know he sold out.
Yeah.
He did pretty good because Saks,
Yeah.
the son, built up a pretty good business. So that was the Stanford business, and what happened up in Pound Ridge, which I left before seeing that, because they always wanted more and more business, and they wanted me to put out more and more editions, and I said it's not going to work because the more editions you put out, the more the cost cost you. You know, the printing and the mailing and all that, and you're going to, the guy who runs $100 ads is going to run 2 $50 ads.
Mhm.
They didn't understand that concept, so I couldn't take it anymore, and I left. However, I was lucky because I had a real estate license.
How did you decide
Well,
to have that as a backup?
Well, that's an interesting story. It's really part of the history of Stanford in a way. I got a real estate license in about 1965 because I had an idea about using that opportunities that you talked about, the classified, and using it as a vehicle for real estate. So a person would want to sell or buy a house. I came up with the idea of using the real estate. Person would put in their house in the paper with a key or it would be keyed with a number.
Mm-hmm.
And they would call the office and say, well, I'm interested in seeing house 1. So we would write it down, house 1, and we'd tell them, go see Mrs. Jones. And then we knew that this person went to see Mrs. Jones. they would do the deal themselves. And for that, I discounted my cost. Instead of being 5% or 6%, I would charge them 2.5%. And in order to do that, I had to have a real estate license.
Yes.
So I went to school, got my real estate license, had Julia Melman, who was my lawyer, go up to Hartford and make sure that I was doing everything correctly, because the real estate business is highly regulated by a state authority, and there was no problem, I could do it. I had all the ads ready to go, and Harry came to me and said, I don't want to do it. So I said, why not? He says, because, wait, Bill Pitt's going to be mad at me. Well, in those days, Bill Pitt was a pretty big real estate guy.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry and he were on a lot of committees together, Stanford Hospital, CTE, there was a few other, and he saw Bill Pitt all the time, and he didn't want to be embarrassed that he was going into competition with Bill Pitt and discounting. So I really had the first idea of being a discounted real estate person. And when you have a partnership and you don't have a way to, that was one of the mistakes I made because I was young when I went into a partnership. There's no way, yes, if one says yes and the other one says no, no wins.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a tie.
Mm-hmm.
So I should have had a way to arbitrate that. So I had to dump that whole idea, which, looking back now, if I didn't sell the business, I might have been doing that. Because I maintained my real estate business all those years,
Mm-hmm.
my license. And I made a couple of deals throughout the year. And another reason I got it, because my father did make some deals from his customers when I was younger. And because he used to go store to store like I did. And one guy said to him, I'm looking for a store. And he knew of a store opening up, and he made the deal.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he didn't have a license, so he didn't get paid for it. So that was another reason I thought I'd get my license, just to be there in case that happens, which did happen throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm no longer in the newspaper business. I had the real estate license, which was a broker, which I could go into my own business. And I picked a company that did a lot of advertising, and a small company, which was Country Living at the time. And they were too small. And William Pitt at the time real estate companies, the independents were kind of in bad shape. Because the real estate market went down the tubes.
Mm-hmm.
And William Pitt was bought by a company called BLT. And they really owned the majority stock of William Pitt. And I knew them because they were involved in revitalizing the south end of Stanford. And I figured that was a good company to get involved with, because part of what they were revitalizing, they were putting apartments and condos and that kind of stuff in the south end. So I said, I might as well go with a company like that. And so ironical, I'm now with William Pitt, or Bill Pitt's business. The other thing that I did while I was in the real estate business, when I was with Country Living, which is now Halstead, because they found the same thing that William Pitt found themselves. They were in bad shape, and Halstead, a New York company, bought them out. And a lot of people came to me and they said, boy, we really should have another country shopper like paper. And over the years, the Advocate got worse and worse and worse. And not only did it get worse, their circulation, which at the time I think was like 25,000 Stanford people, when I looked in to see what they really have, they only really have about 10 to 15,000 circulation now in Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a paper. And I did very well with the first paper. I got a lot of my old customers, like car dealers, and people I knew who worked for somebody else, and a lot of real estate company ads, because I went to them and I said, you're advertising the Advocate, and they still do, but you're not getting a good bang for your buck. The circulation is getting smaller and smaller, and even today it's smaller than it was 3 years ago. And it was very good, and I had about 24 pages of advertising, and about out of 24, 15 pages of advertising. It was a very good money maker, but right after that, everything went down the tubes, really went down the tubes. The car business wasn't what it used to be, the real estate business fell apart, regular retailing went down, you know.
What years were we talking about now?
Well, I'm going back, this is about 2005, 2006. People still come up to me and say, what are you going to do in the next edition? So that was very successful. I was pretty proud of myself that I was able to did it from scratch. I was the only one that did it. I did the selling. I got organizations that give me editorial content. And I went to a printer who was able to print the paper. They bought a mailing list with total circulation of most of Stanford. And I had it shipped to the post office, and I had a paper.
So it was just one edition? that
One
you put?
edition, yeah. So maybe I should give it to you to put into the archives.
Yeah,
I happen to have a copy of my
oh,
desk.
terrific.
Yeah.
Well, let's, we talked about your professional life.
Yeah, well, let me just say other thing that might be interesting
Yeah.
to people who look at this 50 years from now. I was in the newspaper business from the time it was done with hot type, which was type that was metal that was put into trays and put into a machine called the linotype machine. And that's how you did printing a newspaper. You then would put it into a mold, and then that, to make things simple, it was all hot. And when I left the business, it was all cold type, and it was all done with computers. So in my lifetime, I really went through the change of printing, which became offset printing. Offset means you would take the image from a piece of film, and you would go put the copy would go on a piece of rubber, and the rubber would then be, the image from the rubber goes on the paper. That's why it's called offset.
Mm-hmm.
And the image and the pictures are much clearer. So today, most papers, if they're still in business, do it at offset. So that was something that, you know, I remember, I've told my grandkids about the difference of what I've seen in my lifetime.
I can remember there was a driveway alongside of Woolworths, and behind the building next to it was the Stanford Advocate.
Right.
And behind the Stanford Advocate building, which wrapped around the Woolworths store, was their linotype operation. And you would walk back there, and it sounded like machine guns going off.
That's what it was. It was like it was a big typewriter.
Yeah, but then there was a big rack
Right.
and they'd be pulling, you know, there was a keyboard in front.
Right.
And these linotype operators would sit there in this tremendous hot day and this
Right.
heat coming off the molten metal.
Right. And that's how all papers were done. And when
Yeah.
you wanted a picture, you had to make an engraving. And there were a lot of companies who were engraving business. There was a big guy who was down on Canal Street, Anchor Engraving. That was a big business, and when that changed, he had to change his business.
And there's another big engraver on Pulaski Street.
Yeah, that was more magazine engraving.
Yeah.
So I saw that all change. And I like to think that I saw it all change. You know, when my father died, and on his deathbed, we talked about the changes he saw. You know, he came from the horse and wagon in Stanford when he probably had maybe 20,000 people. And when he died, there was about 100,000 people. We all had cars, air conditioning. We went to the moon and all that kind of stuff.
How old was your dad when he passed on?
He was 92 years old, so
Oh.
he did pretty well.
Mhm.
Yeah. My mother died at the same age, so perhaps I'll make it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talked about you got married and then you where did you live?
I lived at 91 Strawberry
Yeah.
Hill, and then my wife talked me into building my own house, because she knew that if I bought a house someplace, I wouldn't move. So we bought a piece of property. She was like the architect chief contractor. We subbed out the whole house.
You did your own subbing?
All subbing. And we built a house in those days for about $85,000.
And where was the house located?
On New England Drive off of Quarry Road, up near the reservoir. As a kid, we used to park on Quarry Road.
Yeah.
That was the necking place.
Right.
So Schaefer's, there was a Jewish family, but the Schaefer's that lived on Quarry Road, the Friedmans lived on Quarry, I don't know if you, Bill Friedman's brother, his brother lived there. And Carl Bennett, that was his house in Stamford before he moved to Greenwich. And that whole property was owned by Grumberger. And he developed the property, then he sold off the pieces. But anyway, we're still there.
How many years ago did you build the house?
About 40 years ago. And so that was a pretty good investment.
Yeah, I'd say so.
The house at the height was probably worth $1.3 million. But everybody thought I was nuts, for doing that. And a friend of mine did the same thing. Alex Goldblum did the same thing, but he was in a business that was similar. So that's what I did.
And now you're living in a house, you have children?
2 children, 2 girls. My wife is now a decorator. She does a lot of decorating work for a lot of people in Stamford. She's very well known.
She does residential?
Residential decorating. And she really started because she did the house. It evolved from the house.
So she's been doing that for many years?
Many years. She does work. She does now children's of friends of ours. And a lot of them moved to Westchester, so she has a pretty good clientele in Westchester. And she's still being called on a weekly basis. And my daughters, one of them had the sales ability that I have, and the other one had the intellectual ability that my wife has. And my one daughter is married. She lives in Denver with two children. And she's the only Jewish educated beautician in Denver. She wanted to become a beautician. I said, you can become a beautician, but you have to go to college first. And because she did that, she has a very good relationship with her customers. She has a lot of high-end customers, and they treat her as an equal, because she's done the same things they have. And she got married late, so they're all her age, and they have older children. So she's developed a nice group of friends and customers there. She's still doing it a little bit. And my other daughter became a computer whiz, and she now works for Google. And she has a very good job with Google. She has about 40, 50 people reporting to her. And I would say she's mid-level. She really doesn't want to go any higher.
Where
In California.
In California.
Right, yeah, which is an amazing operation in itself.
Yeah.
It's a college campus-like operation run by 2 guys who went to Stanford University. And she just built a house. But she took an original house, it was a townhouse, and rehabbed it. And of course, you know who did it. My wife has been out in California, 10 times at least in the last 2 years, doing it for her. Just about completed.
Now you and your wife, are you involved in any religious organizations?
Well, we were along the road. I was very active in the Jewish Center. I started going to the Jewish Center when I was 4 years old in day camp. And I don't remember that exactly, but I do remember the day camp very well. Don't remember it every day, but there are people that are still around Stanford that went to that camp when I was 3, 4 years old. Seymour Lapin is one of them. Shirley Sklar was another one. Helen Heft, who no longer lives in Stanford, was another one. Anyway, so I was involved in from that day forward, I was involved in the Jewish Center. From going to camp, I became a waiter at the camp. We used to have hot meals.
Who was the cook?
Ma Falk. And she used to, her best dish was spaghetti, big spaghetti maker. It was all vegetarian, so we never had meats. And then I became a counselor. and then at that period, I went on my own. I went out in the world. By that time, I graduated college, so I was there for a long time. But
And do you remember, this was Camp J.C.,
Right.
it was located behind the Jewish
yeah,
Center, as I
well, I was
recall.
actually located in the Jewish Center, and the grounds were where the courthouse is now,
Yeah,
and the police station.
right.
And when I was, I would say from 11 through 16, I was there every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
There was a intramural program, and we played, depending on the season, we played basketball, football, touch football, basketball, softball. Joe Carrant was as I remember, he was the physical education director at that point. And an interesting story that I like to tell is at the same time I was on the basketball team of the synagogue. And we used to go for breakfast Sunday mornings at the synagogue. I was a member of the synagogue as a kid, and for my few years, up to about 2 or 3 years ago. But in my youth, I was captain of the basketball team, and Dave Weiss was the coach. And Dave called me up one day and says, "Listen, I can't make it Saturday." It was Saturday afternoon. It was a church league, and we were the last team to play at the Y.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, "Okay, no problem." So he said, so we went down that Saturday, and there's what I call the little kids, and the big kids: Larry, Freddie Phillips, myself, Allie Goldblum, who I still see to this day. I don't remember who. Ronnie Robbins. I don't know if that the name. They were in Stanford for a while, and the little kids was Joe Lieberman and his friends. So my goal was to win the game, and so therefore I didn't put them into the game at all. And after the game, I could hear all the younger kids grumbling to Joe and saying to Joe, Ezra didn't put us in the game. We wasted our time here. So Joe said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. I'll speak to the rabbi." So Joe was relative to Rabbi Aaron Krantz. He was a cousin by marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So the next day was Sunday, and we had a meeting at the synagogue. And the rabbi, after breakfast, he used to have a breakfast, also made, the cook was Malfalk even there. And the rabbi gets up. This is one of the reasons why I didn't care about the synagogue that much. The rabbi gets up and gives a speech on authority, and basically gives me hell because I didn't let the little kids play in the game. And the little kids were, and then the ringmaster of the little kids was Joe Lieberman, who is now Senator Lieberman, who almost became vice president. If he had become vice president, he certainly would have become, I think, in my opinion, president. So that's my story about Joe Lieberman. I quit the team, but then they asked me to come back. So that's my Joe Lieberman story.
So in all these things you've done in your lifetime, did you find any overt anti-Semitism in the newspaper world?
Yeah, there was always a little bit.
Mhm.
In fact, there's a little bit today.
Yeah.
When I take people out, I do feel that when they realize I'm Jewish, they don't come out. I could feel it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel the vibes that, especially for someone who comes from the Midwest or from out of the area, they're dealing with a Jewish guy. But it never hurt me. When I ran the paper, yes,
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of merchants that really, I don't really want to mention names, but I've already mentioned one of those in my story today. And yeah, there was anti-Semitism.
How about in schools?
No, at school, in those days, even the blacks and the whites,
Mm-hmm.
and, I didn't go out with too many non-Jewish girls,
Mm-hmm.
which I really always wanted to because I thought they were better looking than the Jewish girls. But I never, we stayed separate, but I was friendly with all of them. And in fact, I was surprised when I looked at a yearbook of 1957 And if someone said how many Jewish kids went to Stanford High School and graduated in '57, I would say there was 50 or more. And when you count the names, there was only maybe 20.
Mm-hmm.
So my Jewish universe in that time was very small.
What do you do in your leisure time in Stanford?
Well, I'm famous for my perfect game of bowling. I did a lot of bowling in my earlier married life.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in a co-ed league on a Friday night, which was, it was a Jewish league on Friday night. And it was a council of Jewish women had a league, and I bowled a perfect game.
Where was the bowling
The
alley?
bowling alley was on the Snow Furniture Store on West Main Street.
Okay. Boulderama.
Boulderama was on Highfield, on Hamilton Avenue.
Oh.
I think it was 10-pin bowling.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember that like it was yesterday, and I knew I was going to have 12 strikes in a row, 300 game, and I have on my wall in my office, my little cubicle over there, I have a picture of me holding my bowling ball and a scorecard of the game. And all my friends were there, so we always talk about once in a while of my perfect game.
Mm-hmm.
And because I owned a newspaper, I took my picture that's hanging there and I put it on the front page of my perfect game. That was very rarity in those days,
Yeah.
especially for a Jewish guy.
Uh,
But I belong to Rock River Country Club and I play golf. I try to play golf,
mhm.
which is an interesting story in itself because as a kid, Rock River was only for the very wealthy Jews, Stanford Jews.
Yes.
It was started by a few wealthy families who weren't allowed to go to the yacht club. So they started their own country club and they had a golf course. And
Do you recall who the families were?
sure, there was the Frankel family, the Sarner family, the Sosnowitz family, and the main person there was the Spokey family. Because Harold Spokey was in the bank business,
Yeah.
and he was able to drum up enough business to buy this piece of property on Long Ridge Road.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also involved in buying the property for Bicultural. I'm sorry, where Bicultural was on Strawberry Hill. He was involved in the property where the synagogue went.
Mm-hmm.
That was King's School when I was a kid. And King's School then moved up the street on Newfield Avenue. And because Harold was able to make a lot of deals for a lot of people in his time as being involved in the Springdale Bank and Trust Company, which now is, I don't know, I guess Bank of America.
Yeah.
Had a lot of changes. But anyway, so I used to have, what I used to consider the wealthy kids lived up, were members of the club. And I used to go there as guests. And in fact, I remember Larry Rowan going with me at one time to a dance. But as the years went on, they needed members, and the initiation got down as low as a swim club.
Yeah.
So a lot of us who were members of swim clubs joined at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, I was a member of Twin Lakes Swim Club, which is on Haviland Road, which is now out of business. And so my early years with my kids, I was a member of Twin Lakes Swim Club, played a lot of tennis in those days.
Have you done any traveling out of the country?
Yeah, we have, not so much in the recent time, but we have been to Spain and England and France and I guess the big ones. I would like to go to Israel someday. I've never been to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The big trip now that people are taking is to China. I haven't been to the Scandinavian countries. So I really haven't. I've traveled a lot throughout the country since my daughter are out west.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen a lot of the West. In Arizona, I've been to several times. Florida, of course.
Been to the national parks?
Oh, we took a trip to the national parks, which was interesting. We went with a bunch of my friends from Stanford. The Ettingers being one of them, who's very well known in Stanford, one of my peers. And we took a train tour of the national parks.
Mm.
It was the train that the famous train in goes in Europe. What's the name of the train? Anyway, we took a train trip starting in Utah. We went up to, we saw the Tetons, we saw Yellowstone, we went to
Grand Canyon,
Grand Canyon, which I was there before.
Zion,
Zion, not Zion, but another one. It was a very interesting trip.
Bryce.
Yeah, one of those, I remember. You know what, after a while, they all looked the same. But it was very interesting and a good time. We got stuck on the train over Labor Day weekend, which I thought was a kick. My friends weren't happy about that, but we slept and ate on the train.
Mhm. I think the Orient Express.
Orient, right, it's called the American Orient Express. And I've been to Alaska, and I've been to Canada. In Canada, we brought our golf clubs and some beautiful golf courses. And we had to stop playing golf for a minute just to look at the scenery, because this was the western part of Canada. Alaska was very interesting. I'm glad I did that. That was before Vice President Sarah Palin was involved, so it was a non-political trip. My daughter, who works for Google, who worked for a lot of companies, she's been around the world through her business. She's been to just about every country you could think of through her business. But I've been to Hawaii and the Caribbean, and that's the traveling we've taken.
Yeah. The last question I have for you. You've grown up in Stanford, you've been in business in Stanford. When you look back, when you were growing up, when you were in business, and what it looks like as a community today, when was it better?
Well, that's a good question.
I know.
That's why you asked it. Well, you know, when I drive through Stanford, especially when I go down to the south end, which my company's involved in, through where Hawthorne Street used to be and what they've done with the train station when it was an old brown building and now it's a modern building. I think it was better then. I think times were better. It wasn't as, people didn't have as much. But I think, I miss my family relationship. We had all the family in Stanford. Now they're spread all over the country. I guess financially I've done better because the town has changed. My real estate benefited from it. My newspaper world didn't change that much because of it. It actually hurt it. The mall definitely hurt. I was never a fan of the mall. When the mall was talked about being, they went to Harry, who we talked about being a civic leader, and Harry thought it was the greatest thing going. And I said to Harry, no, it's not. He said, why? I said, because it's going to kill all the local businesses. And our business is generated by the local businesses. Oh no, he said, don't worry, they told me it's going to work out fine. And sure enough, not that I was so smart, but I was right.
Right. He must have been in cahoots with Edith Sherman.
Right, and also he was friendly with Bill Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill Pitt was the reason why it changed so much. I don't know if anybody knows that, but the plan changed because Bill Pitt met a guy from either Singer Sewing or a paper company in West Palm Beach. And the guy wanted to move to Stanford. He thought Stanford would be a good place. There was no place for him to move to. And Bill came up with the idea of, hey, we got all this urban redevelopment area. Let's work out something where we can get some corporate people coming to Stanford. And Treasure Avenue right now, all those big corporate buildings were because Bill Pitt convinced that guy, actually the guy convinced himself to come to Stanford. Champion International was the company.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why all those big companies, those big buildings are now on Treasure Boulevard. And the mall was supposed to be what we call an outside-in building. The stores were gonna be able, you were gonna be able to come from the outside into the mall. But they changed the scope and it became an inside thing. So when you go to the mall, you don't go out outside.
No, it's a walled city.
Right. And that killed the town
Yeah.
from a business point of view. And I'm very friendly with Sandy Goldstein and she's done a beautiful job with downtown. But I say she didn't. Because she did set up a town where there's lots of restaurants and a great place
Yeah,
to
a lot of activity in the evening.
A lot of activity and everything. But what happened to the small businessman? He's gone, he can't afford the rents down there, he's not down there. The residential area really didn't change, it kind of became more expensive. Because you had all these corporate people coming into Stamford and they wanted to buy houses, so supply and demand made prices go up, which was good for me because I own my own house, but for the young people who want to buy houses in Stamford, it's not so easy. And the school system today in Stamford is allegedly not so great. I went through the system, everybody my age went through the system. Everybody made it very well. In fact, as we talked about, one guy almost became president. It's a tough town to sell people who are coming in with kids. And the price is high. So to answer your question, business-wise, it hasn't been better. Real estate-wise, it has. If one owned a lot of real estate in those days, they were in a good position. But a businessman, except for a few, there are a few, the guys that did very well are those who own real estate. The founding guys, the people in Stamford that we talked about, the Sarners, the Frankels, Sostowitzes, they were fortunate. Lotstein in the long run.
Yeah, Grumberger.
Grumberger. The older generation, which was my father's generation, had a lot of foresight and they bought a lot of property. And those kids and grandkids are living pretty well today because their great-grandfathers were smart enough to buy real estate. My family always said, why buy? You can always rent. Let another guy have the headache. But in the long run, those people made a lot of money. And they're still making a lot of money. The residential area really hasn't changed that much. If you go north of the Parkway visually, it's not changed too much. So the answer really is I thought it was a great place to live as a kid. Growing up, you knew everybody. You walked downtown, you knew everybody, Jewish, non-Jewish. My kids have moved. My daughter lives in a place right outside of Denver where the town is that way. And my daughter lives not in San Francisco, but Palo Alto, which is a little bit like that. But New Canaan, Darien, and those always kept its small town, which is I would like to live. I would prefer living in a place like that. But of course, there's a whole little story about that one. When I was looking to buy a house or build a house, it was difficult buying a house in Greenwich or Darien or New Canaan because they weren't happy with Jewish people. There was always a token Jew in each one of those towns. Darien, I don't think has many Jews now. New Canaan has a lot, a fair amount. Greenwich has a lot. There's even 3 temples in Greenwich, but you don't have a synagogue in New Canaan. You certainly don't have one in Darien. So that would be my answer. Can't go back though. See, I like change. Most people have a hard time with change, so that's why I'm still working. Because I like the idea of coming into work every day and there's always something new, there's always something changing. My opinion is, if you retire and don't do anything, there's no change. It's the same old thing every day. How many times can you play golf? Especially the way I play golf now, you don't want to play so much. So that's my answer.
Well, thank you. You mentioned that you have the newspaper that we can put on the on a DVD.
Yeah.
And you also have the bowling.
I can give you that, but I'd like to get it back.
Well, we can take a picture of it with the camera,
Sure.
and it'll be on the DVD,
Great,
okay?
yeah.
All right, so thank you very much.
Okay.
I think the interview was
Well, that's a pleasure. I'm looking forward
very
to see it.
interesting.
Uh,
I agree with your thoughts about Stanford.
yeah,
It's the only town in the country where a shopping mall bisects the main Route 1, which I think is a disaster.
right.
And it doesn't integrate itself with the downtown, and that's the reason that there are so many vacancies.
Right. However, to be honest, this is not uncommon in many towns around the country.
Well, the only saving grace that I can think of, if it didn't become a corporate center,
Oh, we would have been in trouble.
we would have been another Bridgeport.
But we're lucky because we're that close to New York,
Yeah.
and that's what saved us.
You're holding, Ezra.
This is Stanford Buyer's Guide. That's the name I came up with. And the reason I came up with that is because when I was in the corporate world, that's what all their papers were called, the Buyer's Guide. I thought it was a good name.
That's the paper, that's the one and only edition.
This is it.
Yeah.
Never had a perfect game.